looking at 1 Corinthians. The Apostle Paul is writing to a church in the city of Corinth, in the country of Greece, and these are new Christians who are trying to sort out what it means to follow Christ. And he's got a great teaching and lesson for them and for us today. If you've been around the church any time at all, you probably have enjoyed some gatherings of believers in Jesus, smaller than this one. We call them small groups. We call them life groups here at Parkside, or missional communities, some of the bigger small groups. But when I was a kid, I grew up in a very small church, country church, and oftentimes on a Sunday night, this would be the best when this would happen. Word would go out to everybody, and everybody was invited that we would go over to somebody's house and have some kind of dessert or sandwiches and just hang out together. It was the best, especially if we went to Bill and Agnes Davis's house, because their son, Steve Davis, was my best friend. And there was just nothing better than going to their house, because Agnes was a really chilled out mom. And you could do things at the Davis house that you couldn't do at my house. And so we'd all go over there. Anybody want to come can come. And the adults, they'd be upstairs, and the boys, we'd go downstairs. They had an unfinished basement, and Steve had a spider bike. So you get somebody drive the spider bike, you tie a rope to it, and you either get roller skates or a skateboard and start bike skating around the unfinished basement. You had to watch out for the metal poles. You couldn't cut your corners too sharp, but that just made it more fun. And I don't know what the girls did. They were off somewhere doing something I never asked. I have no idea what the girls did. But when that evening was over, and we would hear the adults, they'd be upstairs and they're laughing and just having a good time being with each other. When the evening was over, everybody would agree, that was great, that was such a good time, let's do it again. And we would. We'd decide whose house was the next house everybody would go to. So it was food, it was fun, it was fellowship. That's been the trademark of the church from the very beginning. You look in the book of Acts, it's recorded in the history of the church in the second chapter of Acts. And on the day of Pentecost was a huge Jewish festival. And a lot of people there in town, but at that point there were only 120 people who followed Jesus. Very small little church. So, in the morning of Pentecost, 120 people. By evening on the day of Pentecost, there were 3,000 Christians in that city. They had exploded into a megachurch because of some preaching that had taken place. You talk about church growth, that's about as good as it gets. So what do you do with this all of a sudden megachurch where you're trying to get people together and to learn and to grow and to connect with each other? How do you do that? Well, you couldn't do it in a big group with 3,000 people. Now, they started out going to the temple, but they got kicked out of the temple, so they couldn't go there anymore. And so they like to get together to share meals with each other and just share anything that they had with each other. Well, how do you do that with 3,000 people? Well, you break it down into smaller groups. So they met in each other's homes. And it says that as they did that, they would focus on the teachings of the apostles, and they would encourage each other. They would give to each other, even physically. People who had enough and more would give to people who were very poor, so that everybody was kind of evened up as far as meeting their needs. They would eat together. They would have a meal together, and they would pray together. And it tells us that as this happened, as this really healthy dynamic was going on in these groups, in these homes, that more people were coming to know Jesus. Because people were watching, going, look at that. Look at how those people get along. Look at how those people love each other and take care of each other. They're the real deal. They're acting a lot like Jesus when he was here in town. And so people also became followers of Jesus because of that tremendous example that was being set within these home communities. So every good thing was happening there. And that's what the church did for a couple hundred years. They didn't build church buildings. The first church building that we've come across archaeologically is about the second half of the 3rd century. For one thing, when persecution started breaking out against the Christians, you didn't want to advertise that you were a bunch of Christians. Hey, we're meeting in this big building, so come arrest us and torment us. You didn't do that. You were under the radar. And so they met in much smaller groups in homes. And they did it according to this pattern. They would focus on teachings of the apostles. They would encourage each other. They would pray with and for each other, and they would have a meal together. And at the end of the meal, it would always finish up with a climax of the Lord's Supper, or communion as we call it. That's exactly what Jesus did. As he was celebrating the Passover with his disciples, he finished that meal with a new observance, a new kind of a meal called the Lord's Supper. Well, that all went very well, except it wasn't going well in the city of Corinth, because as every good thing was happening in those groups in Jerusalem, and as everything good was happening at Bill and Agnes Davis's house, good things were not happening in these small home groups in the city of Corinth. Actually, it was a disaster. Paul says this. He says, "In the following directives, I have no praise for you. For your meetings do more harm than good. In the first place, I hear that when you come together as a church, there are divisions among you." Now, we know that unity, lack of unity, was a problem within this group of Christians. They were dividing over which leader they followed. My leader's better than your leader. The men and women, we talked last week, men and women weren't interacting very well together. They were divided along gender lines. We find out now that they were also divided along the lines of rich and poor. The haves and the have-nots. It was a big line of demarcation within these home fellowship groups. And Paul says, when you come together and when you have these meals and when you supposedly observe the Lord's Supper, he says, it's not the Lord's Supper you eat. When you're eating, some of you go ahead with your own private suppers. As a result, one person remains hungry, another gets drunk. Don't you have homes to eat and drink in? Do you despise the church of God by humiliating those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you? Certainly not. I will not in this matter. So what was going on in Corinth? And again, these were very new Christians who were trying to get it figured out. When they came together for a meal, they kind of hit the default button and went back to what they knew, and that was, well, when we would go to the temple here in the city, Aphrodite or some of the other pagan temples, it was pretty much a drunken party. So I guess that's what we'll do here. And so that's what they were doing. It was kind of a drunken party. And the rich people, you had rich and poor people. It was a culture with masters and slaves. The rich people would bring very good food into these meals. They'd bring in their shrimp cocktail, lobster tail, filet mignon. The poor people would come in. Maybe all they had was Spam or bologna sandwiches. I happen to like bologna sandwiches, but there was this big difference between who brought what. So the rich people would get over here and they'd eat. Poor people were left out over here. And it was a debacle. Paul says, what are you doing? Don't you understand? Especially if you presume to enter into this thing called the Lord's Supper. Don't you understand what a mockery you're making of that, and what a bad example you're setting for anybody who's watching how you're interacting with each other? This is supposed to be a time of unity, a time of bringing yourself together in a common faith and a common love, and you're divided all over the place. It's just awful. So he goes on then to say, here's what it is. Here's what it's meant to be. Here's what the Lord's Supper stands for. And here's the effect that it should have on us. Now here at Parkside, we observe the Lord's Supper every Sunday. Never miss, never fail. We always do that. But the thing that we have to really focus and concentrate on is that this doesn't become an empty ritual for us. That we do it so often, over and over. We do it the same way every week, that it becomes something mindless and we let our minds wander. And it isn't what it's supposed to be or what it's supposed to mean to us. And so, as Paul instructs these new Christians, he's instructing us too to consider these things as we come together and we observe the Lord's Supper. And if you're brand new here, maybe you don't even understand these terms I'm using. You know, what's this Lord's Supper that's going to happen? Communion, what is that? Okay, well, I'm going to explain it to you so you can understand. And in a little bit, there will be some trays that are passed, and you'll know exactly what's happening when that happens. Now, something else I want to tell you is that we're going to be responding to some of these teachings by expressing ourselves, by singing. So I'm going to offer a short teaching, then we're going to stand and we're going to share together, participate together in expressing that truth to God. So don't think the sermon's over when we get to the next song, okay? We're just getting started. But we're going to stand to do that. We'll sit to learn. We will stand to express ourselves. So Paul says this, first of all, the Lord's Supper is all about remembering. I received from the Lord what I passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, he took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it. He said, "This is my body. When you eat this bread, this is a symbol of my body. I'm going to die for you in just a few hours. Anytime you eat this bread, do it to remember what I'm about to do for you." In the same way, after supper, he took the cup. He said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. When you drink this cup, you come together in this special time together. Do this in remembrance of me. Remember what I'm about to do for you. Always remember, never forget how much I love you, because I love you enough to die for you, to make it possible for you to be reunited with your God." When Amnon Shariah was in the 7th grade, he wrote about his grandmother, Rita Shariah, who was about to speak before a UN assembly. It was a commemoration of the Holocaust, where the Jews, millions of Jews, were put to death by the Nazis. And so this is an annual observance with the UN. And his grandmother was going to speak because she was a Holocaust survivor. She was 2 years old when her family fled from Belgium to France. So she had a vague memory of that. But the night before she was to speak before the UN assembly, she gathered her family around her and her 7th grade grandson there at the family table. And she spoke with them, and Amnon says, "I always knew my grandmother was a Holocaust survivor, but this week I learned more. For the first time, she told me details about her experience. There was something in her manner that told me not to be afraid, to listen. Her father had been sent to Auschwitz, where he and 45 members of our family had been murdered. So she spoke quietly and confidently to me around the family table, and I understand that she was sharing a gift of living memory that I would never forget." And so that's what the disciples took away from that meal after the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, which took place just hours after he had established this remembrance with them. They said, "We understood that this was a sharing of a gift of living memory that we must never forget." Jesus was saying to us, do this to remember what I'm about to do for you. This is an act of sacrifice that is the difference between life and death for you. Always remember, never forget that I loved you enough to die for you. And it's only through my death that you had life. Let's remember. Let's express ourselves to God right now. Jesus gave another explanation of what this meal is to mean to us. He said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood." What's a covenant? A covenant is an agreement between two parties. It's a contract where each one brings something to the agreement that makes it binding and lasting. You buy a car from the bank, and the bank says, "I'll give you the car, you give us the money." If we fail to give them the money, they come back and they take the car. That's how it works in a lot of agreements. Well, Jesus said, through his death, through his sacrifice by dying on the cross, that we have a new agreement with God. Why do we need that? Because the old agreement was impossible for us. There's only two agreements that we can have with God. And the old one was based on living a perfect life. The old agreement is based on law. If you can live perfectly, if you can live exactly as God would live if he were you, then you can have a relationship with God. How many are living up to that level? Nobody is living up to that level. It's impossible. We know we can't do that. And so unless some kind of a different or better agreement came along, we were out of luck. And thankfully, Christ came to bring us that new agreement. Because it's an agreement that's not based on our perfection, but it's based on his perfection and his willingness to sacrifice his perfection on our behalf. He brought the sacrifice of his perfect self who kept the moral code of God in a perfect way because he was and is God, and offered that to pay what was necessary to satisfy justice. There have been so many violations of God's will throughout the centuries. Billions and billions of people violating God's will. And for justice to be just, there has to be a penalty for that. It has to be satisfied somehow. And so God came and he said, I will satisfy the penalty with this profound, deep, pervasive sacrifice that will cover the sins of all mankind for all time. I'll establish a new agreement, a new possibility of coming to God through my death. And so that's what he did when he died on the cross for us. And so the new agreement is this. Christ says, I bring to you my love through sacrifice. I bring to you forgiveness that you don't deserve. I bring to you my love, which is unmerited. I bring to you every good thing that I possess, and I give it to you as my brothers and sisters, as God's children. I give it to you in exchange for what? What do we bring to this agreement? We bring submission. We bring surrender. We bring, God, you've got me. I beg for your mercy, and he extends that because of what Christ did for us on the cross. It's a new covenant. It's a new contract. It's a new agreement. You see, nobody could come to terms with that first contract. Nobody could. Everybody can enter into this new agreement with God if they choose to do that, if they choose to bring that surrender of the will to Christ in exchange for what he gives so freely. Jeremiah the prophet said, the days are coming when I will make a new covenant, and that day is here. And so the cup that we will drink, as Christ offered the wine and as we offer juice here this morning, it's the same symbol, it's the same understanding that Christ has made possible, a coming together, a uniting, an adoption into the family of God because of the sacrifice of his blood on the cross. Let's stand and let's respond. Our communion together is a time to remember, always remember, never forget what Christ did for us. It's a time to thank him so deeply and profoundly for this new agreement, this new contract with God that we have, which is entirely possible because of the death of Christ for us. And it's a proclamation. That's the word that one translator uses. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Communion is one of our identifying marks. Jesus gave us two identifying marks, two physical things that we enter into that shows that we are proud to be known as one of his. The first thing, the first physical thing that he calls us to is baptism. That is that time when we do surrender. We give our will over to God and say, God, I give up, and I'm so sorry for my sins. I will follow you the rest of my life. And so we go through this act of baptism, a washing, a cleansing, a death, a burial, and a resurrection to be raised up to a brand new life. That's the first mark that he gives us. The second mark that he gives us is communion, or the Lord's Supper. He says, as we do this, every week as we come together, as we do this, we are identifying ourselves as ones who understand the meaning of his death, and we embrace his death. We acknowledge that. It makes all the difference in our life and how we live, and what our values are and how we function. It makes all the difference. And it's also a statement to anyone who comes in among us that if they don't understand anything else about us, and even if you're new here this morning and this is all real new to you and you're kind of figuring it out, if you don't understand anything else, understand this about us as we enter into this ceremony, that we are all about understanding the death of Christ and its meaning to us. And it affects us profoundly, and it marks us as ones who have found life in him because of his death. And so we will. We're going to make another expression of our faith together. A lot of up and down this morning, isn't it? It's good for us to stand in the presence of God and to express ourselves in respect to him and affirm and acknowledge these truths. And so I will ask you to stand again And we will sing and we will declare to God, to Christ, who He is. And then we will enter into the service will come, and the trays will come. And if this is your first time, you're going to look at these trays and you'll think, that's a very poor meal there. That's, as Daniel always says, a little bit of juice and a little bit of bread. But it's symbolic. It's the body of Jesus. It's the blood of Jesus that gives us life. We take His life into us as we share in this ancient ritual that Christ has given us, which is as new as today, as meaningful as today and always. Today we proclaim the death of Christ and the coming of Christ and our allegiance to Him. And we will do that until the day we die as followers of Christ. Let's declare that to Him, and then we will commune with Him. You know, Paul goes on in that passage, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but you can read the rest of chapter 11 there. Did that come up as chapter 11? I hope it did. Good. Thank you, Chris, for getting that fixed. He says, you need to be careful when you participate in the Lord's Supper, communion, Eucharist, a lot of different names. He said, you need to discern the body. Make sure that you discern the body rightly so that you don't eat and drink judgment to yourself. He says you need to examine yourself. Do you understand the body? And you might be thinking, you mean I could have done this and been judged for what I just did? Now you tell me. Why didn't you explain that before? Because I'm not worried about any of you and what Paul is talking about here. Because he's not saying you need to come into a communion service having lived a perfect week. Oh, I need to examine myself. I have to be perfect to have done this. No. We come to Christ in communion because we're not perfect and we understand that we need forgiveness. So no, it's not about living a perfect life between communion services. It's not that at all. It's not about some deep theological understanding. Do you understand the depths of the sacrifice of Christ on the cross? That's not what he's saying either. The body he's talking about is this body. What he's saying to the Corinthian people, he's saying, you are the body of Christ. As Jesus went to the Father, as he ascended to heaven, what he left behind to establish his kingdom on earth is his body, his people who carry his spirit. We are Christ on earth. We represent him. We carry out his ministry. We take his values to the world. We draw people to God through him who lives in us. We are the body. And so Paul's saying, understand who you are. Understand the importance of how you conduct yourself. You are Christ in the flesh to so many people. Act like him. And the good news is that here at Parkside, I feel like we do. We're given it everything we've got to act like him and to be a united body and not be fractured and not be off in cliques to ourselves. So if you're new here this morning, I really hope you feel welcome. I hope we've made you feel welcome. And those of us who have been here a while, let's make sure we kind of look around and, it's easy to gravitate to your friends. If you see somebody you don't know, walk up and introduce yourself to them. Okay? Nobody's ever offended by that. That's a nice thing. But we want to make sure always that we understand this to be a very open and welcoming body because we are the body of Jesus and we want to make him proud and represent him well. So we do that here. And a nice way to do that too is in smaller groups. And if you are not in a smaller group, that's a great place to find encouragement, to read the Bible together, to apply that to life, to pray for each other, to share what we need with each other. And if you got a basement, you get a spider bike and a rope and roller skates and let the kids have at it down there. We can help you find a group if you don't have a group like that. But wouldn't it be a nice thing if in our groups, if along with everything else we do, that sometimes we would finish our time together with communion together. Take the body and the blood of Jesus and say, this is what unites us. This is the source of our love. This is the source of our life. Wow, that would take a small group meeting to a new level, wouldn't it? Yeah. So consider that.